In 1939, as Europe descended into darkness, a young woman made a decision that would place her life in constant danger. Every day, armed soldiers patrolled the streets. Families disappeared overnight. Entire neighborhoods lived in fear. Most people were trying to survive. She was trying to save others. Over the next few years, she would help rescue hundreds of children from one of the most terrifying places on Earth. If she had been caught, she would have been tortured and executed. Yet she continued. She carried babies through checkpoints, smuggled children through sewers, hid identities inside glass jars buried beneath the ground. And when the war ended, something unexpected happened. The world moved on. Decades passed. Millions knew the names of generals, politicians, and military leaders. Almost nobody remembered hers. This is the story of the woman who saved 300 children and was nearly forgotten by history. Before the world knew her name, she was simply a social worker living in Warsaw, Poland. Her name was Irena Sendler. She was born in 1910 into a family that believed every human life had value. Her father, a doctor, often treated poor patients who could not afford medical care. He taught his daughter that helping others was not a choice but a responsibility. Those lessons stayed with her. As Europe moved toward war, anti-Semitism spread across the continent. Jewish families faced growing discrimination, restrictions, and violence. Then came September 1939. Germany invaded Poland. Within weeks, Warsaw fell. Life changed overnight. The occupation brought fear, shortages, and brutal control. But the worst was still ahead. In 1940, the Nazis established what would become one of the largest ghettos in occupied Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were forced into a small section of Warsaw surrounded by walls and guards. Disease spread quickly. Food became scarce. Families were trapped. Most of the world had no idea what was happening inside. But Irena did. Because of her work as a social worker, she was one of the few people allowed to enter. Every visit changed her forever. She saw starving children sleeping on sidewalks. She saw parents desperately trying to keep their families alive. She saw fear in every face. And she realized something that would shape the rest of her life. If nobody acted, thousands of children would die. For many people, the situation seemed impossible. For Irena Sendler, it became a mission. One that would eventually place her against one of the most powerful and ruthless regimes in human history. The first child she rescued would change everything. The first time Irena truly understood the scale of the tragedy unfolding inside the Warsaw Ghetto, she could barely sleep afterward. She had seen poverty before. She had seen suffering. But nothing had prepared her for what existed behind those walls. Every day she entered as part of her official duties, carrying documents that allowed her passage. The guards saw another social worker. The families inside saw something very different. They saw one of the few people who could still move freely between their imprisoned world and the outside. The streets were crowded beyond imagination. Entire families lived in single rooms. Children wandered alone, searching for scraps of food. Illness spread rapidly through neighborhoods where medicine barely existed. The smell of hunger seemed to linger in the air itself. Every week, conditions became worse. Every week, more people disappeared. Rumors circulated constantly. Some said the Germans planned to relocate everyone. Others feared something far worse. Nobody knew exactly what was coming, but everyone sensed danger approaching. One afternoon, while visiting a building filled with sick children, Irena met a mother whose face she would never forget. The woman held a small girl tightly against her chest. The child could not have been more than 5 years old. Despite her age, she was unusually quiet. Her large eyes followed every movement in the room. The mother listened carefully as Irena explained the growing risks facing families in the ghetto. Then the woman asked a question that would remain in Irena's memory forever. If you could save her, would she live? There was silence. Not because Irena did not know the answer. but because she knew exactly what the answer was. Inside the ghetto, the child's chances of survival were shrinking every day. Outside, there was at least hope. Yet leaving meant something almost impossible for any parent to accept. It meant trusting strangers. It meant never knowing whether they would see their child again. It meant surrendering the most precious person in their life to uncertainty. The mother understood all of this. So did Irina. For several minutes neither woman spoke. The child rested her head against her mother's shoulder, unaware that a decision was being considered that would determine her future. Finally, tears filled the mother's eyes. She kissed her daughter repeatedly and whispered words only the child could hear. Then she looked back at Irina. "Promise me she will have a chance." Irina promised. It was the most important promise she would ever make. The rescue itself required extraordinary caution. Every movement had to be planned. Every detail mattered. The Germans monitored entrances and exits constantly. A mistake could mean arrest not only for Irina but also for anyone helping her. Yet the operation moved forward. The little girl was eventually removed from the ghetto and placed with people willing to hide her. She received a new identity, a new name, and a new story about who she was. For the first time in months, she was safe. At least for now. That night, Irina sat alone thinking about what had happened. One child had escaped. One life had been given another chance. But behind the walls remained hundreds of thousands more. Thousands of children still faced starvation, disease, and whatever plans the Nazi authorities were preparing for them. The rescue should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like the beginning. Because once she had saved one child, she could no longer pretend she did not know what was happening. She could not walk away. And deep inside, she already knew something else. If it had been possible once, it could be done again. Soon, Irina Sendler would begin building one of the most daring rescue operations of the entire Second World War. And with every child she saved, the danger surrounding her would grow. Saving one child was difficult. Saving hundreds would require something far more dangerous. In the months that followed, Irina realized she could not continue working alone. The risks were becoming too great, and the number of families asking for help continued to grow. Every visit to the Warsaw Ghetto brought new faces, new stories, and new parents desperately searching for any chance to save their children. She understood that courage alone would not be enough. What was needed was organization, secrecy, and people willing to risk everything. Slowly, she began finding them. Some were social workers. Others were nurses, priests, drivers, or ordinary citizens who could no longer ignore what was happening around them. Many had families of their own. Many understood that if they were discovered, imprisonment would be the best possible outcome. Despite the danger, they agreed to help. Piece by piece, an underground rescue network began to emerge. Each member had a specific role. Some forged documents. Others transported children. Others arranged hiding places. Some provided food and clothing. Some helped create entirely new identities. No single person knew every detail of the operation. That secrecy was intentional. If someone was captured and interrogated, they would be unable to expose the entire network. The fewer secrets any individual carried, the greater the chances that everyone else could survive. Meanwhile, conditions inside the ghetto continued to deteriorate. Food rations became even smaller. Disease spread more rapidly. German patrols increased their presence. Families lived with constant fear that their names would appear on deportation lists. At first, many parents hesitated when offered the chance to send their children away. The thought of separation felt unbearable. Some could not imagine placing their sons and daughters in the hands of strangers. Yet with every passing month, reality became harder to ignore. The walls of the ghetto were no longer simply a prison. They were becoming a death sentence. As word spread quietly among families, more parents began seeking out Irina. The conversations were always heartbreaking. Mothers and fathers faced impossible choices.
Some spent days considering the decision.
Others cried throughout the entire discussion. A few changed their minds several times before finally agreeing.
Almost all asked the same question. Will I ever see my child again? No one could answer honestly. Not even Irina.
She refused to make promises she could not guarantee.
The truth was that many families would never be reunited.
The war was growing larger. The future was uncertain.
Every rescue involved enormous risks.
Yet remaining inside the ghetto carried dangers that were becoming impossible to survive.
Many parents ultimately chose hope over certainty.
The children themselves often did not understand what was happening. Some believed they were going on a short trip. Others were told they would stay temporarily with friends. Older children understood more and sometimes resisted leaving their families.
The younger ones often cried when separated from their parents.
Members of the rescue network carried the emotional weight of those moments long after the operations ended. But there was no time to hesitate.
Every day mattered. Every delay could cost lives.
Soon the network developed multiple methods for moving children beyond the ghetto walls.
Some left through legal entrances using false paperwork. Others traveled hidden inside ambulances. Some escaped through buildings connected to areas outside the walls. Every mission required careful planning and perfect timing.
German guards watched constantly, and a single mistake could destroy months of work.
Yet somehow, the rescues continued. 1 child became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became dozens.
What had begun as a single desperate act of compassion was evolving into one of the most extraordinary rescue operations of the war. But as the number of children increased, so did the attention of the authorities.
The Germans were tightening their control over Warsaw.
Informants were everywhere.
Arrests were becoming more common.
And somewhere within the city, dangerous eyes were beginning to notice that children were disappearing.
The network was succeeding.
Which meant it was also becoming a target. As the rescue network expanded, one question became more urgent than ever.
How do you secretly move children out of one of the most heavily guarded places in occupied Europe?
There was no single answer.
Every rescue demanded creativity, courage, and sometimes incredible luck.
The Warsaw Ghetto was surrounded by walls, guards, checkpoints, and constant surveillance.
German authorities controlled movement in and out of the area. Anyone caught helping Jewish families faced severe punishment. Yet despite those obstacles, children continued to disappear from the ghetto and reappear in safety elsewhere. Each rescue was different.
Each carried its own risks.
One day, a child might leave through a legal entrance using forged identification papers.
Another day, a different child might be hidden beneath blankets inside a vehicle authorized to enter and leave the ghetto. Sometimes children were guided through buildings connected to areas outside the walls. Sometimes older children escaped through routes known only to members of the underground resistance.
Every operation required careful planning. Every operation could end in disaster.
The younger children were often the most difficult to move.
Babies could cry unexpectedly. Toddlers could become frightened. A single sound at the wrong moment might attract attention from guards.
Members of the network constantly worried about what would happen if a child panicked during an escape.
Yet somehow, the rescues continued. Many of the people involved later remembered the extraordinary calm shown by some of the children.
Even at very young ages, they seemed to understand that remaining silent could mean survival.
Others were simply too exhausted by hunger and hardship to resist.
Their lives had already been shaped by fear long before the rescue began.
The emotional burden on parents was even greater.
Before a child left, there was usually one final goodbye.
Many parents tried to remain strong.
Some smiled through tears.
Others whispered prayers.
Some gave their children small objects to remember them by: a photograph, a religious symbol, a handwritten note.
Many knew they might never meet again. Those moments haunted Irina for the rest of her life.
She later admitted that the parents were often the true heroes of the operation. They faced choices almost impossible to imagine.
Trusting strangers with their children required extraordinary courage. Yet countless mothers and fathers made that sacrifice because they believed it offered the only chance for survival. Once outside the ghetto, a new challenge began. The children needed new identities. Their names had to change.
Their histories had to change. Sometimes even their birthdays were altered. They were placed with foster families, religious institutions, orphanages, or trusted members of the resistance. Each location had to be carefully selected. The wrong person could betray the entire operation. One careless conversation could lead investigators directly to hidden children. Fear was constant. Every knock on a door created anxiety. Every unexpected visitor raised suspicion. Everyone involved understood the stakes. Still, the network continued growing. By now, dozens of children had been saved. Then dozens became scores. The success brought hope. But it also brought a new danger. The Germans were becoming increasingly suspicious. Reports circulated about underground resistance activities throughout Warsaw. Security measures tightened. More arrests occurred. Informants searched for opportunities to earn rewards by exposing hidden operations. The atmosphere became even more dangerous than before. One evening, after a particularly difficult rescue, Irina sat reviewing information gathered by the network. She studied lists of names. Names of children who had escaped. Names of families who remained trapped. Names of safe locations. The responsibility felt enormous. Because she understood something that few others fully appreciated. Saving a child was only half the mission. The other half was making sure those children could one day discover who they truly were. Without that, families lost by war might remain lost forever. And so Irina began keeping a secret record. A decision that would later become one of the most important actions of her entire life. But if the Germans ever discovered those records, everyone connected to the network would be doomed. Every child who left the Warsaw Ghetto carried two identities. The first was the false identity created to keep them alive. The second was their real identity, the name given by their parents, the name that connected them to their family, their history, and their past. For the rescue network, protecting both identities became essential. Saving children from immediate danger was not enough. One day, the war would end. One day, surviving parents might search for their sons and daughters. One day, children who had grown up under false names would want to know who they really were. But how could that information be preserved without exposing everyone involved? The answer came to Irina gradually. She began creating detailed records. Every rescued child was carefully documented. Their real name, their new name, and information about where they had been placed were written down with extraordinary care. The records were never meant for the present. They were meant for the future. A future nobody could guarantee would arrive. The information was incredibly dangerous. If German authorities discovered those lists, they would immediately know that a large-scale rescue operation existed. They could track foster families, orphanages, religious institutions, and members of the resistance. Hundreds of people would be arrested. Possibly thousands. Yet without the records, many children would permanently lose any connection to their families. Irina refused to let that happen. So she continued documenting every rescue. Late at night, often by dim light, she updated the lists. The work required patience and precision. A single mistake could destroy a family's chance of reunion after the war. Every name mattered. Every detail mattered. Soon the records became too extensive to keep in ordinary locations. They needed protection. That was when one of the most famous decisions of the entire operation was made. The lists were placed inside glass jars. The containers protected the papers from moisture and decay. More importantly, they could be hidden. Carefully sealed, the jars were buried beneath the ground in secret locations known only to a handful of trusted people. Beneath ordinary soil lay the identities of hundreds of children. The jars became silent witnesses to an extraordinary mission. Above them, war raged. Below them, hope waited.
Each time a new rescue occurred, the records were updated. The responsibility weighed heavily on Irina.
She understood that those buried documents represented far more than names. They represented promises.
Promises made to parents. Promises made to children. Promises made to the future. Meanwhile, the situation inside the Warsaw Ghetto was becoming catastrophic.
Reports arriving through underground channels painted a terrifying picture.
Entire families were vanishing. Deportations increased dramatically.
Trains departed regularly, carrying thousands of people toward destinations surrounded by rumors and fear.
At first, many still hoped those deportations were merely relocations. But evidence suggested otherwise. Stories filtered back from witnesses. Few people returned.
Those who did carried horrifying accounts. The rescue network realized time was running out.
Every week brought new urgency. Every day delayed meant more lives at risk. The pace of operations accelerated.
Children were moved whenever opportunities appeared.
Safe houses became busier. Forged documents were produced constantly. Volunteers worked under immense pressure, knowing that failure could be fatal. Yet despite their efforts, there were never enough resources. Never enough time. Never enough places to hide everyone.
For every child rescued, countless others remained trapped.
That reality haunted Irina.
She celebrated each life saved. But she never forgot those she could not reach. As 1942 gave way to 1943, the dangers surrounding the network intensified. German authorities were conducting more investigations. Underground resistance groups faced increasing pressure.
Arrests were occurring across Warsaw.
And somewhere within the Nazi security apparatus, information was beginning to surface.
Someone was helping children escape. Someone was defying the occupation. Someone was embarrassing the regime.
The search for that person had already begun. And it was slowly moving closer to Irina Sendler. By 1943, Warsaw had become a city of fear.
German patrols filled the streets. Informants operated in every neighborhood. Entire families disappeared overnight.
Nobody knew whom to trust. A careless word spoken to the wrong person could lead to arrest, imprisonment, or execution.
For members of the resistance, every day felt borrowed. For Irina Sendler, the danger was greater than ever.
The rescue network had grown far beyond what anyone imagined possible. Hundreds of children had already been removed from the ghetto and placed in hiding.
The operation depended on secrecy, discipline, and luck. Unfortunately, luck rarely lasts forever.
Rumors began spreading throughout underground circles that German authorities were investigating unusual activities connected to social welfare organizations.
Questions were being asked. Documents were being reviewed.
People associated with resistance networks were disappearing. Nobody knew exactly how much the Germans had discovered. But everyone sensed trouble approaching.
Irina continued her work anyway.
She understood the risks. She simply believed the children faced even greater ones.
Each morning she left home knowing she might not return. Each evening she wondered whether the next day would bring a rest.
Yet fear had become such a constant companion that she learned to function despite it. The mission continued.
The rescues continued.
The records hidden beneath the earth continued growing. Then one morning, everything changed. There was a knock at the door. Not the friendly knock of a neighbor.
Not the casual knock of a visitor. A hard, deliberate knock. The kind that instantly filled a room with dread. Before she even opened the door, Irina knew something was wrong.
Outside stood officers of the Gestapo.
The secret police.
One of the most feared organizations in Nazi-occupied Europe.
For a brief moment, time seemed to stop.
Years later, survivors would often describe similar moments in the same way. The mind races.
Every possibility appears at once. Escape routes, explanations, fears, memories.
But there was no escape. The officers entered. They began searching immediately. Drawers were opened.
Documents examined. Furniture moved. Personal belongings scattered. Every minute felt endless. Irina remained outwardly calm, but internally she understood the magnitude of the danger.
If the Gestapo found evidence of the rescue network, the consequences would extend far beyond her own arrest.
Safe houses would be exposed. Children would be discovered.
Volunteers would be captured.
Families hiding rescued children would be executed. Entire sections of the underground operation could collapse.
The search continued. The officers questioned her repeatedly.
Where had she been? Who did she know? Why had certain records attracted attention? The questions came one after another.
Yet despite the pressure, they failed to uncover the most important secret. The lists.
The names. The records hidden away from their reach.
The jars remained safe.
At least for the moment.
Eventually, the officers made their decision.
Irina was arrested.
As they led her away, she knew her fate was uncertain. People taken by the Gestapo often vanished.
Some were executed immediately. Others endured brutal interrogations. Many never returned.
Friends and colleagues who learned of her arrest feared the worst.
The rescue network itself entered a state of crisis.
Without Irina, communication became more difficult.
Operations slowed. Members worried that arrests might spread throughout the organization. Everyone understood what usually happened during Gestapo interrogations. The Nazis wanted names.
And they had countless methods for obtaining them.
Inside her cell, Irina faced a terrifying reality. She possessed information that could destroy the entire rescue effort. Information about hidden children. Information about volunteers. Information about safe locations. Information about everything.
The Germans would do everything possible to obtain it.
The question was no longer whether she would be interrogated. The question was how much suffering she could endure before they broke her.
And soon, the Gestapo would begin trying. The prison walls were cold, damp, and silent.
For most prisoners brought there by the Gestapo, silence itself became a form of fear. It allowed the imagination to fill the darkness with possibilities far worse than reality.
But for Irina Sendler, reality would soon prove terrifying enough.
The interrogations began almost immediately. The Gestapo did not care about justice. They cared about information. Names. Locations. Contacts. Safe houses. Resistance networks. Anything that could help them destroy those opposing Nazi rule. Irina was brought into small rooms where officers questioned her for hours at a time.
They demanded details about her work.
They demanded explanations for suspicious activities. They demanded names of collaborators.
Each answer she refused to give increased their anger.
Each moment of silence increased the danger. At first, the interrogators believed she would eventually cooperate. Many prisoners did. The human body has limits. Fear has limits. Pain has limits. The Gestapo built its reputation around exploiting those limits.
When questioning alone failed, they turned to violence.
The beatings began.
Every strike carried the same message.
Talk. Give us the names. Tell us where the children are hidden. Tell us who helped you. Yet Irina remained silent.
Not because she felt no fear. Not because she felt no pain. But because she understood the consequences. Every name she revealed could lead to another arrest.
Every location she exposed could condemn innocent families. Every secret surrendered might destroy everything the network had built.
So she endured.
Day after day. Interrogation after interrogation.
The physical damage became severe. Her captors broke bones in her hands and feet. The injuries were so serious that she would suffer their effects for the rest of her life. Walking became difficult.
Standing became painful.
Still she refused. Still she protected the names. Still she protected the children. Many years later, people would ask how she managed to withstand such treatment. She always rejected the idea that she possessed extraordinary courage. Instead, she focused on something else. The parents. Whenever she felt herself weakening, she remembered the mothers who had handed over their children with tears in their eyes. She remembered the fathers who knew they might never see their sons and daughters again. She remembered the promises she had made. Compared to what those families had sacrificed, she believed she had no right to surrender. Outside the prison, members of the resistance watched events unfold with growing alarm. News of her arrest spread quickly through underground channels. Everyone understood the danger. If Irina died, years of work might vanish with her. If she broke under interrogation, hundreds of hidden children could be discovered. The situation was becoming desperate. Resistance leaders began discussing possibilities. Could she be rescued? Could she be moved? Could something be done before it was too late? The answers were uncertain. Meanwhile, the Gestapo reached a conclusion of their own. They believed they had extracted everything they could. And because they still lacked the information they wanted, they made a decision. Irina Sendler would be executed. The sentence was clear. Death. For most prisoners, such a decision marked the end of the story. But in one of the most astonishing twists of her life, fate and the resistance were preparing an outcome the Nazis never expected. As the date of her execution approached, a secret operation began unfolding beyond the prison walls. An operation so risky that failure would cost multiple lives. And its objective was simple. Save the woman who had spent years saving everyone else. The official decision had been made. Irina Sendler was to die. Inside the prison, she was informed that her execution had been approved. The Nazis considered her another enemy of the Reich, another prisoner whose life no longer held any value. For them, the matter was settled. For Irina, the news brought a strange sense of calm. She had already spent months facing interrogation, torture, and uncertainty. Death had been present in every moment since her arrest. Now it simply had a date attached to it. What troubled her most was not her own fate. It was the children. She worried about the records hidden beneath the ground. She worried about the families sheltering rescued children. She worried about the volunteers still risking their lives every day. If she died, she hoped the network would survive. That hope became her final comfort. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, members of the Polish resistance were refusing to accept her fate. The underground organization had spent years watching Irina risk everything to save others. They knew the importance of her work. They knew how many lives she had touched. Most importantly, they knew she was too valuable to lose. Quietly, a plan began to form. It was dangerous, expensive, and far from guaranteed to succeed. But it represented the only chance. The resistance had contacts in places where few people expected. Occupied Poland was filled with corruption, fear, and desperation. Even within Nazi-controlled systems, there were individuals willing to accept bribes if the price was high enough. The underground movement gathered resources. Money changed hands. Messages moved through secret channels. Trusted intermediaries negotiated in complete secrecy. Every step carried enormous risk. If the Gestapo discovered the operation, everyone involved would likely be executed. Yet the resistance continued. They had one objective: keep Irina alive. Then came the day. Prison guards arrived. They ordered her from her cell. Like many prisoners before her, she believed she was being taken to her execution. She had no reason to think otherwise. As she walked through the prison corridors, she prepared herself for the end. The uncertainty was gone. The waiting was over. She expected that within hours she would be dead. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Rather than being taken to an execution site, she was escorted outside under unusual circumstances.
The details unfolded quickly and with deliberate confusion.
Orders were exchanged.
Instructions were given. Guards behaved differently than expected.
Then, suddenly, she was told something almost impossible to believe.
She was free. At first, she could barely comprehend what she was hearing. Free? How? Why?
The explanation emerged later.
Members of the resistance had successfully bribed officials involved in her case.
Records were altered.
Procedures were manipulated.
Her execution was officially reported as completed. According to Nazi documents, Irina Sendler was dead. In reality, she was standing outside prison walls.
Alive. The moment felt surreal. Many prisoners dreamed of freedom. Almost none received it.
Yet freedom came with a new problem. She could not simply return home. Officially, the Gestapo believed she had been executed. If anyone discovered the truth, they would immediately begin searching for her again. So she vanished. Forced into hiding, she adopted false identities and moved carefully through occupied Poland.
Friends sheltered her when possible. Resistance members protected her movements. She lived as a ghost.
A woman legally dead. A woman the Nazis believed no longer existed. And while many people in her situation would have focused entirely on survival, Irina made a different decision. As soon as she was physically able, she returned to the mission.
The arrests. The torture.
The broken bones.
The near execution.
None of it convinced her to stop. Instead, she resumed helping the very children whose names she had protected through months of suffering.
The war was not over. The deportations were not over.
The killing was not over. And Irina believed that as long as lives could still be saved, her work was not finished. What she did not know was that the darkest period of the war was still unfolding. And the true scale of the tragedy would only become clear when the guns finally fell silent. When the war finally ended in Europe in 1945, people poured into the streets.
For 6 years they had endured occupation, fear, loss, and uncertainty. Cities lay in ruins. Families searched desperately for loved ones.
Survivors emerged from prisons, camps, and hiding places. Everywhere, people asked the same questions.
Who survived? Who was gone? Who might still return? For many, the end of the war brought celebration. For Irina Sendler, it brought another mission. The children.
Throughout the conflict, she had protected their identities with extraordinary care. Hidden beneath the ground were the glass jars containing names, records, and connections between children and their families.
Now those records became invaluable.
Carefully, the jars were recovered. Inside were the names she had spent years protecting.
Hundreds of names. Hundreds of stories. Hundreds of lives.
For the first time, there was hope that families separated by war might be reunited.
Irina and others began the painstaking process of searching for surviving relatives. Letters were sent.
Inquiries were made. Records were examined.
Every possible lead was pursued. Some reunions happened.
They were emotional beyond words. Parents who had survived discovered that their children were alive. Children learned their real names.
Families embraced after years of believing they had lost one another forever.
For those moments alone, the years of danger seemed worthwhile.
But many stories ended differently.
As more information emerged about what had happened during the Holocaust, a terrible reality became impossible to ignore. Millions had been murdered. Entire communities had vanished.
Countless parents who entrusted their children to rescuers never returned.
Many children waiting to be reunited eventually learned that no family remained to find. Those were the moments Irina found hardest to bear. She had saved lives.
But she could not save everyone. No one could.
Sometimes she sat with children who asked questions nobody wanted to answer.
Where is my mother? Did my father survive? When will they come for me? Often, there were no happy answers. The war had stolen too much.
Still, many of the rescued children grew up, built families, and created lives that would never have existed without the risks taken years earlier.
Doctors, teachers, engineers, parents, grandparents.
Entire generations existed because someone had refused to stand by and do nothing. As post-war Europe rebuilt itself, new political realities emerged. Poland fell under communist control.
The country focused on reconstruction and survival. Public discussion of many wartime resistance activities became complicated by politics. And gradually, something unexpected happened.
The world began forgetting.
Not the war itself. Not the major battles.
Not the famous leaders. Those names filled books and documentaries. Those stories appeared in classrooms. But many of the individuals who quietly risked everything to save others received far less attention.
Irina Sendler was one of them.
She returned to an ordinary life.
She never sought fame. She never demanded recognition.
She rarely spoke about herself. When people praised her actions, she often redirected attention toward others who had participated in the rescue effort. She insisted that countless brave individuals deserved credit. In her mind, she had simply done what was necessary.
Years turned into decades.
The children she saved became adults.
The adults became parents. Then grandparents.
Meanwhile, much of the world remained unaware of the woman who had helped rescue them. The jars were remembered by historians.
The survivors remembered.
But outside those circles, her name faded into obscurity. One of the greatest rescue stories of the Second World War was quietly disappearing from public memory. And for nearly half a century, very few people would notice.
For decades, Irina Sendler lived in relative obscurity. The world moved forward. New wars emerged. New crises captured headlines.
New generations grew up learning about famous political leaders, military commanders, and major battles of the Second World War. Meanwhile, one of the most extraordinary rescue stories of the Holocaust remained largely unknown.
Irina rarely complained.
She never launched campaigns to promote her own achievements. She never sought celebrity status. If anything, she seemed uncomfortable with attention. When asked about her actions, she often insisted that she had not done enough. Those who knew her found the statement astonishing. After all, she had helped save hundreds of children. Yet she carried a different perspective. She remembered the thousands she could not reach.
She remembered the families destroyed before help could arrive.
She remembered the overwhelming scale of the tragedy. Compared to that loss, she felt her contribution was incomplete. As the years passed, fewer and fewer people recognized her name. Eventually, even many historians paid little attention to her story. Then something unexpected happened.
Not in Poland. Not in Europe.
But thousands of miles away in the United States. In the late 1990s, a group of high school students began researching Holocaust history for a school project. Like many students, they expected to find stories that were already well known. Instead, they stumbled across a brief reference to a woman named Irina Sendler.
The information was surprisingly limited.
According to one source, she had helped save approximately 2,500 Jewish children during the war. The students were stunned.
How could someone accomplish something so extraordinary and remain almost unknown? At first, they assumed there must be a mistake. Surely such a person would be famous. Surely books had been written. Surely documentaries existed.
Yet the more they searched, the more they realized how little public attention her story had received.
Curiosity became determination.
The students decided to investigate further. What began as a simple history assignment slowly transformed into something much larger.
They gathered information, interviewed experts, collected documents,
examined historical records,
and eventually they created a presentation about Irina's life.
The project attracted attention.
Audiences reacted emotionally. Many people were hearing her story for the very first time.
The students quickly realized they had uncovered something important. As interest grew, they expanded their work into a theatrical production called Life in a Jar.
The title referenced the glass jars where Irina had hidden the names of rescued children during the war. The performances touched audiences deeply. People cried. People asked questions. People wanted to learn more.
Most importantly, people began speaking Irina Sendler's name again.
News organizations noticed. Historians noticed. Communities noticed.
The story spread far beyond what anyone expected.
Then came an extraordinary opportunity. The students learned that Irina was still alive. She was elderly now, living quietly in Poland.
Yet after everything she had endured, she remained alive to witness the renewed interest in her story.
Communication began.
Letters were exchanged. Messages crossed continents. The students who had spent years researching her life suddenly found themselves corresponding with the woman they admired.
For Irina, the experience was deeply moving. After decades of relative anonymity, young people from another country were working tirelessly to ensure her story would not disappear.
It was something she never expected. And something she never forgot.
The project continued growing. More performances. More recognition. More awareness. Slowly, the world began rediscovering the woman history had nearly forgotten.
But even as honors and awards started arriving, Irina continued insisting on the same message she had repeated for years. She was not the hero. The true heroes, she said, were the parents who found the strength to let their children go. And the children themselves, who survived one of history's darkest chapters. Still, the world was finally beginning to understand what those students had discovered. One woman had risked everything.
And because she did, thousands of lives would continue for generations.
As the story of Irina Sendler spread across the world, recognition finally began to arrive. Historians published articles. Organizations honored her work.
Governments acknowledged her courage.
People who had never heard her name before were suddenly discovering one of the most remarkable rescue operations of the Second World War. For many, the attention seemed long overdue. For Irina, it felt uncomfortable. She accepted honors politely, but she never appeared interested in fame. Whenever journalists praised her bravery, she often responded in a way that surprised them. She insisted she had simply done what any decent person should have done. Many found that impossible to believe. After all, most people would never risk torture, imprisonment, and execution to save strangers.
Yet Irina genuinely viewed her actions differently.
To her, the real mystery was not why she helped. The mystery was why more people didn't.
As public awareness increased, prestigious awards followed.
She received numerous national and international honors. Survivors and descendants of survivors sought opportunities to thank her personally.
Ceremonies were organized. Speeches were given. Crowds applauded. But behind every award stood a painful reality.
The reason those honors existed was because millions of others had not survived. The recognition reminded her not only of lives saved but also of lives lost. That perspective never left her. One of the most significant moments came when she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Supporters around the world believed she deserved it.
The nomination generated considerable attention. Many people assumed she would win. After learning about her story, they could hardly imagine a more worthy candidate. Yet the prize ultimately went to someone else. Observers reacted with disappointment. Some expressed outrage.
Others argued that her contribution had been overlooked once again.
Irina herself showed little concern.
She had never worked for awards. She had never worked for recognition. She had never worked for history books. She had worked for children. And the children had survived. That mattered more than any trophy. As the years passed, invitations arrived from around the world.
Schools taught lessons about her life. Museums included her story in exhibitions about the Holocaust.
documentaries introduced her to new audiences. Many of the children she had saved remained deeply connected to her.
Some visited whenever possible. Others wrote letters.
Some brought their own children and grandchildren to meet her.
Those encounters were often emotional.
Standing before her were living reminders of the mission she had begun decades earlier.
Not just the children she rescued, but their descendants as well. Entire family trees existed because one woman had refused to look away. Researchers eventually estimated that thousands of people were alive because of the rescue network's efforts. Children became adults. Adults became parents. Parents became grandparents. Generations continued.
What began as a handful of desperate decisions inside the Warsaw Ghetto had multiplied across time itself. Yet even while the world increasingly celebrated her accomplishments, Irina remained haunted by the same thought.
There should have been more. More children rescued. More families reunited. More lives saved.
It was a burden she carried until the end of her life. A burden common among many who survived history's darkest moments. They remembered not only what they achieved. They remembered what they could not achieve.
And no amount of recognition could erase that memory.
Still, the world was finally learning a lesson that transcended awards, politics, and even history itself.
One person may not be able to save everyone. But one person can save someone. And sometimes, someone becomes hundreds. Then hundreds become thousands. And thousands become generations.
Long before the world rediscovered Irina Sendler, the children she helped rescue had never forgotten her. For many of them, memories of the war remained fragmented.
Some remembered hiding. Some remembered fear. Some remembered being separated from their parents.
Others were so young that they retained only faint impressions, faces, voices, sounds, moments that never completely disappeared.
But one memory appeared again and again. Someone had helped them.
Someone had appeared during the darkest chapter of their lives and given them a chance to survive.
As decades passed, survivors began sharing their stories publicly.
Interviews were recorded. Memoirs were published. Historical archives collected testimonies.
Within those accounts, Irina's name surfaced repeatedly. Not because she had promoted herself.
Not because she had sought recognition. But because the children themselves insisted on telling the truth. Many described the terror of leaving their parents. The confusion of receiving a new name.
The challenge of pretending to be someone else. For young children, the transition was often overwhelming. One day they were living with their family.
The next, they were hidden among strangers. Some had to learn new prayers.
Some had to hide their background completely.
Some lived in constant fear of saying the wrong thing.
A simple mistake could expose them. A single sentence could reveal their identity.
Even after reaching safety, danger remained everywhere. Yet despite those fears, they survived. And as adults, many spent years reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that made survival possible. Again and again, they reached the same conclusion. Without the rescue network, they would almost certainly have died.
Many later met one another.
Children who had once been hidden in different locations discovered they shared a common history.
Some became lifelong friends.
Others collaborated on educational projects to preserve the memory of what had happened. Together, they formed a living testament to the impact of a single decision. The decision not to remain silent. One survivor recalled learning about Irina's role years after the war ended. As a child, she had known only fragments of the story. Eventually, she discovered the extent of the operation and the risks involved. The realization stunned her. She had survived because strangers risked execution. Not for money. Not for fame. Not for personal gain. Simply because they believed her life mattered. Many survivors struggled to fully comprehend that sacrifice. They knew what happened to people caught helping Jews during the occupation. Entire families could be executed. Homes could be destroyed. Lives could be erased.
Yet Irina and her colleagues continued anyway.
For the rescued children, that fact remained astonishing. As they grew older, many dedicated themselves to ensuring future generations understood what had happened.
They visited schools, participated in interviews, shared family histories with children and grandchildren. Some carried photographs. Some carried documents. Some carried memories. All carried gratitude. One survivor later expressed a thought shared by many others.
The world sees heroes in movies.
We met one in real life.
Yet whenever those survivors praised her, Irina redirected the credit. She reminded them that countless people had participated.
Drivers, nurses, priests, social workers, foster families, resistance members, ordinary citizens who made extraordinary choices.
She believed history often focused too much on individuals and not enough on collective courage.
Perhaps she was right. But even among those brave people, her role remained unique.
Because when the operation needed leadership, she stepped forward. When the risks increased, she continued. When torture came, she endured. When death approached, she refused to betray the children.
The survivors knew that. And unlike much of the world, they never forgot it.
As the years passed and the number of living witnesses gradually declined, a new challenge emerged.
How could future generations remember lessons from a time they never experienced? That question would become increasingly important.
Because the story of Irina Sendler was never only about the past. It was also a warning for the future. History often feels distant.
Dates blur together. Names fade. Events become chapters in textbooks. For many people, the Second World War belongs to another era entirely, a world of black and white photographs and stories told by grandparents.
But the story of Irina Sendler refuses to remain trapped in the past.
Because at its heart, it asks a question that every generation must answer. What do ordinary people do when confronted with injustice? That question existed in Warsaw during the 1940s. It exists today. It will exist tomorrow. Irina was not born a hero.
She was not a military commander. She was not a politician. She possessed no special power capable of changing the course of a global war. She was an ordinary woman who encountered extraordinary circumstances. And when those circumstances demanded a choice, she made one.
Again and again. Day after day. Year after year.
The importance of that choice cannot be measured solely by the number of children saved.
The number itself is remarkable. But the deeper lesson lies elsewhere.
Most people who commit acts of courage never know how their actions will end. When Irina helped the first child escape, she could not predict the future.
She did not know whether the operation would succeed.
She did not know whether she would survive. She did not know whether anyone would ever remember her name.
She acted anyway.
That is what makes her story so powerful.
Not certainty. Action despite uncertainty.
Throughout history, many people have waited for perfect conditions before doing what they believed was right.
Perfect safety. Perfect knowledge. Perfect confidence. Those conditions rarely arrive. Irina understood that.
Every rescue involved risk.
Every decision involved fear.
Every success existed alongside the possibility of failure.
Yet she moved forward. Modern audiences sometimes imagine courage as the absence of fear. The reality is often the opposite. True courage frequently means acting while fear remains present. By all accounts, Irina understood danger perfectly. She knew what happened to people who were caught.
She knew what the Gestapo was capable of.
She knew the consequences.
And still she continued.
That lesson resonates far beyond the events of World War II. Teachers share her story with students because it demonstrates moral responsibility.
Parents share her story with children because it demonstrates compassion.
Historians share her story because it demonstrates how individual choices influence history.
the story survives because it contains something timeless.
A reminder that human beings always possess choices.
Sometimes those choices are small. Sometimes they are enormous.
But they matter. For every child rescued by Irina's network, there were countless moments when someone could have chosen differently. Someone could have looked away. Someone could have remained silent. Someone could have decided the risk was too great. Instead, people chose to help. Those choices accumulated. One decision became another. Then another. Until hundreds of lives were transformed. The lesson is both inspiring and uncomfortable. Inspiring because it demonstrates what courage can achieve. Uncomfortable because it removes excuses. It reminds us that ordinary individuals possess far more influence than they often realize. History is not shaped only by leaders. Sometimes it is shaped by social workers, teachers, parents, neighbors, friends, people who refuse to accept that nothing can be done. That may be the most enduring legacy of Irina Sendler. Not simply the lives she saved, but the example she left behind. An example that continues challenging new generations long after her own time ended. And perhaps that is why her story still matters. Because every generation eventually encounters its own moment of choice. And when that moment arrives, the question remains the same. What will we do? As public recognition of Irina Sendler grew during the final years of her life, journalists frequently asked the same question. How did she become a hero? The answer always surprised them. Because Irina rejected the word entirely. Again and again, she insisted that she was not a hero. To many people, the statement seemed absurd. How could someone who risked torture, imprisonment, and execution to save children not be considered heroic? How could someone responsible for rescuing hundreds, possibly thousands when future generations were included, not deserve that title? Yet Irina remained consistent. She believed the real heroes were elsewhere. The parents. She never forgot the mothers who handed over their children knowing they might never see them again. She never forgot the fathers who forced themselves to remain strong while saying goodbye. She never forgot the tears. The fear. The uncertainty. Those parents faced decisions almost impossible to imagine. When history celebrates rescue operations, it often focuses on the rescuers. Irina understood that another form of courage existed as well. The courage to let go. Many of the families she encountered had only two options. Keep their children and almost certainly face catastrophe together. Or send them away with strangers and hope they survived. Neither choice felt fair. Neither choice felt humane. Yet thousands of parents confronted that reality. Some spent sleepless nights deciding. Some argued. Some prayed. Some delayed until the very last moment. Others made their decision immediately because they understood how little time remained. In every case, the choice demanded extraordinary strength. That is why Irina often redirected attention toward them. She believed history overlooked their sacrifice. And perhaps she was right. Most of those parents never became famous. Most never received awards. Many did not survive the war. Yet without their courage, countless rescues would never have occurred. Irina also emphasized something else. The operation had never been the work of one person. Popular stories often focus on individuals because individual stories are easier to tell. Reality is usually more complicated. Behind every rescue stood a network. Drivers who transported children. Families who provided shelter. Clergy who offered protection. Resistance members who forged documents. Volunteers who delivered messages. Ordinary people performing extraordinary tasks. If any link in that chain failed, lives could be lost. The success of the mission depended on cooperation. It depended on trust. It depended on collective courage. Perhaps that perspective explains why fame never seemed to change her. While others celebrated her achievements,
she continued speaking about responsibility rather than recognition,
about duty rather than glory, about compassion rather than heroism.
Even after international awards arrived, her worldview remained remarkably unchanged. She still believed she had simply done what conscience required.
Many people admired that humility. Others found it difficult to understand. Modern society often treats heroes as exceptional individuals separated from ordinary people. Irina viewed the matter differently. She believed ordinary people were capable of extraordinary choices.
The difference was not who they were.
The difference was what they chose to do.
That belief may have been the foundation of everything she accomplished.
Because if ordinary people can change history, then responsibility belongs to everyone. Not just leaders. Not just governments. Everyone. It is a powerful idea. And perhaps a frightening one. Because it means we cannot always wait for someone else to act.
Sometimes history places the decision directly in front of us.
That was the lesson Irina carried throughout her life.
A lesson she hoped others would learn as well. And as her life entered its final chapter, the world was finally beginning to understand just how important that lesson truly was. As the 21st century began, Irina Sendler found herself experiencing something she never expected.
People wanted to hear her story.
For decades, she had lived quietly, carrying memories that few outside a small circle truly understood. Now journalists, students, historians, educators, and survivors sought her out.
Invitations arrived from around the world. Schools taught lessons about her work. Documentaries featured her story.
At an age when many people are gradually forgotten, Irina was finally being remembered. Yet even then, she remained remarkably unchanged. Visitors who met her often expected someone larger than life. Instead, they encountered a modest elderly woman who spoke softly and rarely focused on herself. When conversations turned toward praise, she often redirected them. When people described her as extraordinary, she spoke about others.
When audiences applauded, she reminded them of those who never survived.
Her perspective had been shaped by memories that never left her.
The war was over. The danger was over.
But remembrance remained.
Some survivors visited her whenever possible. Others sent letters. Many brought photographs of children and grandchildren. For Irina, those visits carried special meaning.
Every face represented a future that almost never happened. Every child represented a life rescued decades earlier. Every grandchild represented a victory over those who had tried to destroy entire families. The Nazis had attempted to erase generations. Instead, new generations stood before her. Living proof that hatred had failed.
One visitor would bring pictures of a growing family.
Another would share news about a career. Another would introduce a newborn child. Again and again, Irina witnessed the consequences of decisions made long ago. Not consequences measured in statistics.
Consequences measured in lives.
Meanwhile, public recognition continued increasing.
Books were written. Films were produced. Educational programs expanded.
Her story reached audiences that previous generations could never have imagined. Millions of people who had never heard her name were learning it for the first time.
The irony was impossible to ignore.
The woman history had nearly forgotten was now becoming a symbol of moral courage around the world. Yet despite the growing attention, age was taking its toll. The injuries she suffered during Gestapo imprisonment had affected her health throughout her life. The passage of time added its own challenges. Walking became more difficult. Energy became more limited. Still, she remained engaged whenever possible. She understood that the number of living witnesses to the Holocaust was shrinking. Each year, more voices fell silent. Each year, preserving memory became more important. She believed future generations needed to understand not only what happened but also why it happened. Hatred rarely appears all at once. It grows gradually.
Prejudice becomes discrimination. Discrimination becomes persecution. Persecution becomes tragedy.
Irina had witnessed that process firsthand. And she wanted future generations to recognize the warning signs before history repeated itself. In her later years, she often expressed concern that people might focus too heavily on heroic stories while forgetting the larger lessons. The purpose of remembering was not simply admiration. The purpose was understanding. Understanding how ordinary societies can descend into cruelty. Understanding how fear can corrupt institutions. Understanding how silence can empower injustice. Those lessons mattered just as much as the rescues themselves. Perhaps more. Because the future would depend on whether people learned them. As her life approached its final chapter, Irina could see that her story was finally reaching the world. The recognition had come late. Very late. But it had come. And because it had, millions would continue hearing about the children, the jars, the rescue network, and the choices that made survival possible. The woman history almost forgot was no longer forgotten. But the greatest measure of her legacy was still waiting to be understood. When historians measure the impact of a life, they often focus on numbers. How many people were influenced? How many lives were changed? How many achievements were accomplished? In the case of Irina Sendler, those numbers are extraordinary. Hundreds of children were rescued directly through the network she helped organize. Thousands of descendants exist today because those children survived. Entire family lines continued because one woman, and many others alongside her, refused to surrender to fear. Yet numbers tell only part of the story. The true legacy of Irina Sendler cannot be measured solely through statistics. It can be found in choices. One choice in particular. The choice to act. History is filled with moments when people recognize that something terrible is happening. Most acknowledge it. Some discuss it. A few decide to do something about it. Irina belonged to that final group. When she entered the Warsaw Ghetto and witnessed suffering, she could have focused exclusively on her own safety. Few would have blamed her. The risks were obvious. The consequences were severe. The danger was real. Instead, she made a different decision. Then she made it again the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. Over time, those decisions accumulated. A single act became a mission. A mission became a network. A network became a lifeline. And that lifeline saved hundreds of children. Many people imagine history as something shaped only by presidents, kings, generals, and governments. Yet stories like Irina's reveal another truth. History is also shaped by ordinary individuals confronting extraordinary circumstances. The teacher who protects a student. The neighbor who helps a stranger. The citizen who refuses to remain silent. The parent who sacrifices for a child. These choices rarely appear dramatic in the moment. Their significance often becomes visible only years later. Sometimes decades later. That is exactly what happened with Irina. When she helped rescue the first child, she had no way of knowing how far the consequences would reach. She could not foresee grandchildren who had not yet been born. She could not foresee students in another country rediscovering her story half a century later. She could not foresee documentaries, books, museums, and classrooms discussing her life. She simply acted according to her conscience. That may be the most important lesson of all. Few people ever know the full impact of their actions. A decision made today may influence lives far beyond what anyone can imagine. Kindness spreads. Courage spreads. Compassion spreads. Just as fear and hatred can spread. The direction depends on choices. That truth connects the past to the present. The world has changed enormously since the 1940s. Technology has changed. Governments have changed. Societies have changed. Human nature, however, remains remarkably familiar. People still face moments when helping carries risks. People still encounter situations where remaining silent is easier than speaking. People still decide whether to act or look away. That is why Irina's story continues resonating with new generations.
Not because it belongs only to history, but because it belongs to humanity.
It reminds us what people are capable of when conscience becomes stronger than fear. And it reminds us what becomes possible when even a small group refuses to accept that nothing can be done. For decades, the world nearly forgot her. Today, her story travels across continents,
Across languages, across generations.
The children she saved grew old.
Their children grew old. New generations continue arriving.
And every one of them stands as evidence of a simple truth.
One person cannot save the entire world.
But for someone, one person can become the entire world.
That was Irina Sendler's gift.
And it is why her legacy will endure long after all the witnesses are gone.
There are many famous names in history. Names carved into monuments. Names printed in textbooks. Names repeated generation after generation. And then there are people like Irina Sendler.
People whose actions changed countless lives, yet somehow slipped through the cracks of public memory. For decades, that seemed destined to be her fate. While military leaders filled documentaries and political figures dominated historical discussions, the woman who helped save hundreds of children remained largely unknown outside specialist circles. It is one of history's strangest contradictions. The louder a person seeks recognition, the more likely the world is to notice. The quieter a person serves, the easier it becomes to overlook them.
Irina belonged firmly to the second group.
She never built a public image. She never promoted her accomplishments. She never tried to shape her own legacy. As a result, history almost lost her story. Had a handful of students not become curious? Had survivors not continued speaking?
Had historians not preserved records? Millions of people today might never know her name. That possibility is deeply unsettling. Because if someone like Irina can nearly disappear from memory, how many other stories have already been lost? How many acts of courage remain hidden? How many ordinary people changed lives without ever receiving recognition?
History remembers some heroes.
It forgets many others. The difference is not always based on what they accomplished.
Sometimes it is based simply on who continued telling the story.
In that sense, memory carries responsibility. Every generation chooses which stories survive. Every generation decides what lessons deserve preservation.
The story of Irina Sendler survived because enough people believed it mattered. And it matters for a reason larger than one individual. It demonstrates that courage does not require power.
It demonstrates that compassion can survive even in environments designed to destroy it. It demonstrates that human beings always possess choices.
Even when those choices are dangerous. Even when those choices are unpopular. Even when those choices demand sacrifice. That is why her story continues resonating decades after the war. Not because she was perfect. Not because she was fearless. But because she acted when action mattered. History often feels overwhelming. The scale of world events can make individual efforts appear insignificant.
One person against a system.
One voice against a crowd. One act against enormous forces.
Yet Irina's life reveals something important.
Large outcomes often begin with small decisions. One rescued child.
Then another. Then another.
Eventually, those individual lives formed a legacy spanning generations.
The lesson is simple.
Never underestimate the consequences of doing the right thing. Especially when nobody is watching. Especially when no reward is guaranteed.
Especially when history may never remember your name. Because the value of an action is not determined by recognition.
It is determined by its impact. And by that measure, Irina Sendler's impact was immeasurable. The world almost forgot her. But the lives she saved never did. And neither should we. When people hear stories about extraordinary courage, they often assume the individuals involved feel pride when looking back. They imagine satisfaction,
fulfillment, a sense of victory.
But many survivors of history's darkest moments carry something else.
Regret. Not regret for what they did. Regret for what they could not do.
Irina Sendler was no exception.
Throughout her later years, interviewers repeatedly asked whether she felt proud of her accomplishments.
Her answers were often unexpected. Instead of speaking about success, she spoke about failure.
Not because the rescue mission failed.
It saved hundreds of children. But because she never stopped thinking about those she could not save. The faces remained with her. The families remained with her. The opportunities missed by hours, days, or weeks remained with her. For every successful rescue, there were others that never happened.
Sometimes the family could not be reached in time. Sometimes circumstances changed too quickly. Sometimes danger made intervention impossible.
Sometimes entire communities disappeared before help arrived. These memories never left her.
Many people tried reassuring her.
They pointed out the obvious. She had accomplished more than almost anyone could have imagined. She had risked everything. She had saved lives. She had endured torture without betraying others. Yet none of those facts erased the losses she remembered. That mindset is common among people who witness large-scale tragedy.
When surrounded by immense suffering, success often feels incomplete.
Saving hundreds still means confronting the reality that thousands were lost.
The achievement remains extraordinary. The grief remains real.
Both can exist simultaneously.
Irina understood that better than most.
As she grew older, she spoke openly about this burden. Not to diminish what had been achieved, but to honor those who never had the chance to grow old. Those who never built families. Those whose futures ended before they truly began.
She wanted people to remember them too. Because memory was never just about celebrating survivors. It was also about acknowledging loss.
In many ways, that perspective reveals the depth of her humanity. She never viewed rescued children as numbers. Each child represented a unique life.
A unique family. A unique future.
When one could not be saved, she felt that loss personally. Even decades later. Perhaps that is why praise never fully satisfied her.
The people offering praise saw the success.
She remembered the cost. The people offering praise saw the lives rescued.
She remembered the lives destroyed.
The people offering praise saw a hero. She remembered frightened children, desperate parents, and impossible decisions.
History often simplifies complex stories.
It prefers clear victories,
clear heroes, clear endings. Real life is rarely so neat.
The story of Irina Sendler contains triumph. But it also contains sorrow,
hope,
but also grief,
success,
but also regret. And perhaps that complexity is exactly what makes her story so powerful.
Because it reflects reality.
A reality in which courage does not erase pain. A reality in which doing the right thing does not guarantee happiness.
A reality in which even extraordinary achievements can coexist with heartbreak.
Yet despite all of that, she never suggested the effort had been pointless.
Not once.
Because every child saved mattered.
Every life mattered. Every future mattered.
And if given the opportunity to live those years again, she would almost certainly make the same choices.
No matter the cost. No matter the pain. No matter the regret. Because some things are simply worth fighting for. Imagine for a moment that Irina Sendler had made a different choice. Imagine she entered the Warsaw Ghetto, witnessed the suffering, and decided the danger was simply too great. Nobody would have blamed her. Most people would have understood.
After all, she had a life of her own to protect. A future.
Friends. Family. Dreams. Choosing safety would have been understandable. Perhaps even expected. Yet history would have been different. Hundreds of children would have remained trapped.
Hundreds of futures would have disappeared.
thousands of descendants alive today would never have been born. Entire family trees would simply not exist.
That is the extraordinary thing about human choices.
We rarely see their full consequences.
Most decisions appear small in the moment.
A conversation. A promise. A risk.
A refusal to remain silent. Only later do we understand how far the effects traveled. Irina never knew the full impact of her actions.
No one could.
Even today, historians cannot calculate the exact number of lives touched by the rescue network.
The influence spread across generations. Across countries. Across decades.
A child survived.
Then became a parent. That parent raised children. Those children raised families of their own. The chain continued. Life producing more life. Hope producing more hope. The Nazis attempted to destroy entire futures. Instead, those futures multiplied. That may be the greatest victory hidden within Irina's story. Not simply survival. Continuation. The continuation of families.
The continuation of culture.
The continuation of memory. The continuation of humanity itself.
Every time one of those descendants learns what happened, the story begins again.
A grandchild hears about a rescued grandmother.
A student reads about the jars hidden beneath the ground. A teacher shares the story in a classroom.
A parent explains it to a child. The echo continues.
Far beyond the lifetime of any individual.
Far beyond the war itself. Far beyond Irina.
That is why her story remains relevant.
Not because it belongs to the past, but because it continues shaping the future. Every generation inherits examples. Examples of cruelty. Examples of indifference.
Examples of courage.
Examples of compassion. The stories we choose to remember help determine which examples survive. And among all the stories left by the 20th century, few demonstrate moral courage more clearly than this one.
A woman without political power.
Without wealth. Without military authority. Without protection. Standing against one of the most brutal systems in human history. Not with weapons. Not with armies. But with conviction. With compassion. With a refusal to accept that innocent children should be abandoned.
History often celebrates those who changed the world.
Irina Sendler did something even more profound. She changed individual worlds. One child at a time.
And because she did, the world itself became different.
Not dramatically. Not all at once. But permanently. The greatest legacies are often built that way. Quietly. Patiently. One life at a time.
And few people embodied that truth more completely than the woman history almost forgot. In 2008, at the age of 98, Irina Sendler passed away. She left this world quietly, much as she had lived for most of her life. There were no grand celebrations.
No victory parades.
No monuments large enough to capture what she had done.
And perhaps that was fitting.
Because her story was never truly about recognition.
It was about responsibility.
About what happens when an ordinary person refuses to accept that suffering is someone else's problem.
During one of the darkest periods in human history, countless people looked away. Irina did not. Countless people remained silent. Irina did not. Countless people believed nothing could be done. Irina proved otherwise.
She never commanded armies. She never governed nations.
She never held immense power.
Yet she changed the course of hundreds of lives. And through those lives, she changed thousands more.
Today, somewhere in the world, there are families who exist because a young social worker made a choice decades ago. Children laugh. Parents embrace their sons and daughters. Grandparents tell stories. Entire generations continue because one woman refused to surrender her humanity. That is her true memorial. Not a statue. Not an award. Not a title. But life itself. The lives that continued because she acted. The lives that continue even now. History often remembers the powerful. Sometimes it remembers the brave. But the people who leave the deepest mark are often those who remind us what humanity is capable of at its very best. Irina Sendler was one of those people. For years, history nearly forgot her. Today, we remember. Not because she wanted fame. Not because she sought recognition. But because her story contains a lesson every generation needs to hear. One person cannot save everyone. But one person can save someone. And for that someone, it can mean everything. Thank you for watching. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the forgotten heroes of history deserve to be remembered, make sure to subscribe to History Forgot Them and join us for more extraordinary true stories that changed the world, often without the world ever noticing. Until next time, remember. History is filled with famous names. But some of its greatest heroes were almost forgotten.